Hi, Kairos family. It's your girl, Dr. K, and I am here with two amazing history teachers. We have Laura and Brianna, and we want to introduce you to them. And we're going to start by letting them tell you a little bit about themselves, how long they've been teaching at Kairos, and then we're going to get into the interview that will give you a deep dive into some amazing things we've seen in our history in ninth grade. So at this time, I'm going to start with Laura. Tell the audience a little bit more about you and what brought you to Kairos and why you love teaching history.
This is my second year at Kairos. I was here last year. I actually taught science, so kind of a switch up, but history is more my background, especially modern history, which is what our students are learning. I have, a bachelor's in international studies, a master's in international relations, and it makes sense to talk about the topics that we're talking about and offer up kind of a different lens that you don't necessarily get when you have a purely historical background, which is why it works so well that me and Brianna work together, because she has that historical background. So we balance out really well.
All right, well, let's pass it over to Brianna. Tell the audience a little bit more about you and how long you've been working here at Kairos.
Yeah, so this is also my second year at Kairos. I taught fifth grade history last year, so I wanted to shout them out because I love them very much. And I teach ninth grade history with Laura. We have been friends since 2016, so a really long time. We actually got our masters together. And so part of what I love about teaching history, similar to what Laura said, is I love being able to connect the past to what is going on in the world every day, both that our kids experience, but also things that they don't experience. We talked about Ukraine, and they, for the most part, know nothing about the Ukraine. They've never been to the Ukraine, but they have a hunger to learn because we are very intentional about connecting things that have happened overseas in the past to the things that they go through on a daily basis, and getting to watch them make those connections then on their own, because we've given them the foundation to do that, is one of the many, many things that I love about teaching history, and especially teaching history here at Kairos, because we have the freedom, and I would even say luxury to do that. So
yeah. I love that. At Kairos, we have done branding where we talk about reimagining education and even using the Summit platform. With that in mind, my first question is, tell me about your lesson planning and your internalization process and how you prep for that amazing lesson that I saw the kids really engaged in the hallway.
So I'll talk a little bit about the lesson because I planned it, and Brianna can talk more about internalizing because I don't know how that worked for her. But
Okay.
We actually ended up combining two projects together. Summit, the way it's set up, is phenomenal in offering projects and offering these kind of elements that are throughout all of them to offer students the highest leverage learning for them. And so we combined projects on revolutions and independence and said, well, why not kind of teach them together and then just have a through line be, how are these things separate? So we did that. And, it's really nice to start a project with kind of an entry event, and you throw them into this experience, and then we get to debrief that and they get to reflect on it. And so it's well, what's a way that we can do that? It's really hard to bring experiences into history because we can't, no one wants to go around simulating World War II, but we want to bring these experiences to them. And so I was how can I do that? And my family is really big into board games, and I was risk obviously makes sense. You are conquering, that's what we're talking about. We're going to talk about imperialism, we're going to talk about colonialism through the lens of empires. And I was that would be a really good opportunity for them to get that experience, and then we can step back and say, how did people get to this point, and then why do they want something different? And so it was super easy. I met with my instructional coach Tyler, or our instructional coach Tyler, and he was go for it, love it. If you can make it work, you can make it work. He was it's going to be chaotic and the kids are going to love it, so go with it. And it was easy. I think I just looked at the rules and was how can we adapt this for our students? And it was so straightforward and natural that I think when I showed it to Brianna, she was this is going to be great.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I wanted to just kind of piggyback there and say that outside of the box thinking and making it relevant. What did you want to add to that, Brianna, when you think about the internalization of it?
Yeah, so one thing that I think is huge about the Summit platform is our ability to take the time to plan really cool stuff. And so because the project is already sort of scaffolded and built out, Laura then had the opportunity to then create this unique experience like from scratch and then implement it. So in terms of the internalization process, we share everything with each other. We use the same slides, we use the same templates, we use everything sort of together. And so once she had created the rules and sort of the flow of, okay, here's how we're going to introduce the activity, here's what they should be doing during this time, here's what they're going to do after the activity, and here's how it's going to connect to the broader project. I was able to have that conversation with her and ask sort of like those follow-up questions, like, okay, so when we do this, what do you mean here? And those sorts of things. And then all that was left to do was just do it. I will say that one thing that is really huge for my internalization process, and I think it's probably true for Laura, is like every time we do something in class, almost immediately, either in transitions or during lunch, I'm like, okay, how did your class go? She's like, how did your class go? We like debrief. And so on some level, there's a lot of front end internalization where I'm looking over the materials, I'm asking those questions, we're getting on the same page in terms of how we're going to implement it, so all of our kids can sort of receive the same experience, while also knowing that all of our classes operate a little bit differently. So there's always going to be those little tweaks that are sort of in the moment. And then once we do it the first time, the second time, the third time, checking in with each other to say, hey, when I did this, it went really well. How did your class go? What did they take away from it? And so a lot of it is on the front end, but a good part of it is also to just like in the moment. Like I see it, I implement it. Okay, and now how do I pivot for my next class? How do I pivot for my next class? Was the bulk, I think, in terms of this experience in particular, when you're doing something so hands-on, it's just getting to talk to each other. Like, how did that go for you? And then we talk about it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Brianna. One thing that I really appreciated about what you said was the strategies about debriefing and looking at the data and pivoting in the moment and having that flexible mindset. And I also love the fact that you really employ equity strategies about giving the kids exactly what they need and not having a one-size-fits-all approach. I want the audience to really get into what was the lesson objective and did most scholars actually master the lesson? Because it looked great, but what were we trying to go for? What was the objective of that lesson?
So the objective was like, it was more of a reflection. We wanted them to come away from this activity and then in a follow-up discussion, be able to reflect on what they did and relate that back to our project. So they completed the game. They came back in, they, counted all their cards, figured out who won. And then it was like, all right, answer these questions. Why did you start with the number of resources you did? Why did other groups start with the number they did? What do you think that means? There are also questions on how do you think this relates to our project on revolutions and independence. There were questions on whether or not they would want to play it again, just like in terms of like, did they think it was accessible? What they want to do like better or different in the future? And then whether or not they had any sort of strategy. And they had really good responses to that, to the point that I was like, oh, wait a minute, this is going to be so easy when we have our follow-up conversation for the next class. And so today, actually, in our classes so far, we've started by saying, here's our project, here's what we're going to start talking about today. How do you think the activity we did comes into this? And they're able to sit there and say,
connected it back.
Exactly. They're able to sit there and say, if our project is on revolutions and independence, and right now we're talking about colonialism and imperialism, the activity that we did relates because we were simulating that in a way. And they're like, people started with different resources because the world's not fair. Some people have more resources in different places, or just like in terms of natural resources. So they were really like very easily able to kind of get what we wanted them to get from this activity, to then turn it around and say, well, why was it easy for other people to do it? What inspired or what allowed like Europeans and some countries in Asia to go on and say, it's my right to colonize or to build an empire in these other places. And they've done a really, really good job of turning that around and being like, I know exactly why. And in fact, I'm ready to talk about it more. So it's been really good seeing them do that. And I think across the board so far today, they've gotten what we wanted them to get from that experience.
I think the biggest
Wonderful
is providing like writing opportunities. So they do the activity, they come back into class, they're raring to go. Like I had a kid last week who was like, hold on, if it was that easy for us to just join forces, why don't more people join forces? And I'm like, great question, let's pause.
critical thinking.
Let's write about it. And by giving them the opportunity to verbally reflect, but also reflect through like written means. It really engages them in the like deeper like cognitive thinking that we want them to do. So that way on Monday, when they came in and they were like, okay, what are we doing today? And we introduce these concepts to them, they're already primed and ready because they've not only said it out loud to each other in the game, but they've also really thought about it and really like reflected in a way that it requires them to remember, because when you write things, you remember them better. And so they're doing a lot of the thinking and the internalizing themselves without even really realizing it, which I think is the best part of the way that sort of Laura planned this lesson, is because there's a very clear evolution of like what they should be doing and what they should be taking away. And then they make those discoveries on their own when they come back after a whole weekend of shenanigans and whatever those like ninth graders do. And they're already remembering these things that we wanted them to remember. And now when they have to read documents that are a little bit more heavy, when they're having to engage with vocabulary that's unfamiliar, they feel more confident and more able to engage with those materials, because on some level they know, oh, I know what's going on, even if I don't know what's going on. And we see that when we do these sorts of things with them, the likelihood of them asking questions goes up. The likelihood of them giving richer answers like goes up, because they've had something that's very tangible for them. And so I think even tomorrow with our additional classes, like we'll really, I think almost at least 95% of the kids will probably have met the objective. There's always gonna be that 5% that I'm like, you kind of was snoozing through last week. The majority of them are
right.
That's really exciting for us.
Wonderful. I love the fact that you can tell even through the screen the synergy that the two of you have. And even what I can appreciate how Laura started, that even when we talk about an objective, you can find that in project-based learning, and it has a lot of different layers. So thank you, ladies, for going through the layers, talking about the KAHS skills and the critical thinking and the other narrative skills that we kind of tap into when you plan a lesson. All right. What steps did you take to ensure all of your scholars were actually engaged and they were learning?
We structured the lesson in a way that before we even went out into the hallway to do this activity, we annotated as a class the directions. And so even if the language or the wording of the directions was somewhat complex for some of our students, because we were able to do it together and ask those questions and kind of drive home what we wanted them to take from the directions, it was really high leverage and impactful for all of our students. And I think that like by the time we made it into the hallway, they were so ready to start playing, because we had built up like, you know, you have it up that you can do. And they were like, I'm gonna do this first, I'm gonna do this first. And so it was super easy to translate that into going into the hallway. And then because it was experiential, all they had to do was take a turn, right? And if they didn't know what they wanted to do on their first turn, I was there to guide them. Brianna was there to guide them as well. That by the time it was their second or third turn, they were like, I already know what I'm gonna do. I know what I'm gonna do. Or they're yelling across the room, like, do this, you know, trying to tell their friends. So they were so engaged in it because we had spent that time like front loading what are the expectations and what are the rules for this to help you then enjoy this activity and take away what we want you to.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. And you just mentioned about it being experiential learning. Tell me about that process and why is it so important when we think about project-based learning?
So this is like one of my favorite things to talk about. When I was in high school, I did like an experiential learning program that really like sort of revolutionized like my views of education. And so part of what drew me to KAHS was like the project-based learning that we do. I think oftentimes we sort of use those terms very interchangeably, like, oh, experiential learning is project-based learning and project-based learning is experiential learning. And they're not inherently the same, though they do overlap a lot. And so what we really try to do with our kids is sort of make very clear, like sometimes we experience things and we get to sort of go through this cycle of, okay, I do the thing and then I reflect on the thing. What did it mean? What did I actually do? How did it make me feel? What can I take away from it? Other times we have very clear structures and guides for, okay, we're going to read, we're going to write, we're going to internalize, we're going to create. And I think what is great about Summit in particular, what is great about KAHS is as teachers, we have this sort of foundation of projects like, okay, here's what they should be learning. here's what they should be producing. And then as teachers, we get to then bring the experience to them. And whether that shows up through field trips, whether that shows up in games like Laura was able to prepare, whether that shows up in bringing in guest speakers to the classroom and doing panels and doing research symposiums. We have a lot of ideas for the type of experiences we want our kids to go through that then can support the project-based learning that they're doing in the classroom, where they connect these big experiences and these big feelings to then, okay, how am I then receiving information? How am I then producing something, you know, for a grade to demonstrate I've actually learned something, whether that's through an experience or not through an experience?
Absolutely. And I think about it's like learning through doing, right? So all of those are great examples about doing something. All right, ladies, we are in the home stretch. I only have one question remaining for you. What advice would you give other teachers who struggle with internalizing lessons on the Summit platform and doing exactly what you just said, experiential learning, and making it sticky for the scholars?
I think this is something that it's like the more you get to play around with Summit, the more you realize what it can do for you and how you can make it work for you and your students. So when we like talk about projects, like Brianna and I have created a project, we've created power focus areas, we've combined projects, we've completely changed the order of it to the point where if you were to look at what our Summit course was at the beginning of the year and what it is now, you'd be like, wait a minute, what? So it's really about like taking it and like making it your own and not being afraid to do that. I think in my first year here, I was like, I will do everything Summit is telling me to. I will not stray. But now I'm like, wait a minute, like this video is not good or this activity is not good. How can we make these experiences better for our students? And like, how can we make them relatable for our students? Really just looking at it and saying, you know, if this is the learning outcome I want them to have, do they need to get there the way that Summit is, you know, showing that they should get there? Or is there a way that's going to work better for me and my kids in my classroom? And so I think it's like, you got to play around with it. You have to play around with it. We've planned lessons that have been horrible, but the kids are like, we're never doing this again. History sucks. But then we have all these cool lessons that they're like, walk out of class and they're like, I love history and I can't wait to go to history, you know, next time. And we've got kids still coming up to us. Can we play Risk again? When are we going to play? Like, and we did a project at the beginning of the year where students got to do a simulation and they still talk about it. And they're like, can we do that again? So they're hungry for these experiences and these activities that go beyond just what a base platform offers. And to what Brianna said earlier about, you know, Summit has it there for you to then take it to the next level. Like, it can't be more true. You can't go wrong with what Summit's base curriculum has. You can only make it better. And like, I think we need to get into that as a school and as like a culture.
Absolutely.
Like, it's a great platform and we need to be using it to like the best of its abilities for us.
I think that is like my biggest piece of advice too, is I feel like last year, sort of my early struggle and sort of my early frustration was like so much focusing on the things that weren't working in Summit that I didn't allow myself to take what was working and then build off of it. And so to Laura's point, it's like, if you can identify as a teacher, like, okay, what are the things that Summit had me do that actually worked really well in the classroom? Perfect. What was it about that worked really well? And how can I then build off of it? The more that you internalize those things and get that feedback from the students, or even like reflect on how lessons went on a regular basis, then the more comfortable you get with saying, okay, when I think about this project, I know this is going to work. I know this is going to work. I know this is going to work. Here we have a gap. Here we have a gap. How can I fill those gaps? I think playing around with it, being familiar with it, and not being afraid to say, this worked really well, how can I take it further? And not being afraid to say, this will not work well, and here's how I know. And then supplementing that with something else. I think it's such a fine dance, but at the end of the day, like, the more you do it and the more comfortable you feel, the easier it becomes, because now you're just in like autopilot. You're like, yep, that's gonna work. Nope, that's not. How can I fix it? And not being afraid to do that.
Absolutely. I heard two things that resonated with me when I was listening to you talk. I heard empowerment. So both of you were basically saying, as a teacher, when you're empowered to teach and you can make those moves, you can keep it going in the right direction. And I also heard, when we talked about experiential learning, we said it was learning by doing, but it sounds like y'all are teaching by doing. when you start teaching and you figure out what works, what doesn't work, how do you try it, you can actually really enjoy the space more. So I definitely wanted to take the time to say thank you for dropping those nuggets and those jewels on our audience. And when we think about the people that are going to be listening to these video, think about our parents, our stakeholders, and even your fellow colleagues. Is there anything else you would like to share with them that I haven't asked you, or you feel like is really pivotal or vital to either your experience or ways that you can kind of motivate them to, like you said, steer the course and to really engage or to have a different experience with the content and the curriculum so that they too can shine and have wonderful lessons like the one you displayed?
I think the biggest thing I would say is like not being afraid to just like get feedback from the students, but also just to like share your ideas with each other. Like part of the reason why I think Laura and I have such successful like classes and experiences is because we have a foundational friendship, but even if we didn't have that, like we take those opportunities to get to know each other and to have conversations, say, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. What do you think? Last year, famously, I'm going to shout out Lee Mellon. He did a simulation with one of his history classes that he sort of like took over last year. And I sat in and watched it, and he let me sit in and watch it. And I was like, oh, this is sick. Like, I loved it. I took some notes. I was like, okay, here's how we set up for it. Here's how we prepped for it. Here's how we introduced the kids to it. And like having that conversation with him was something I could then take into this year and into other things that we have done, even last year. And so I think in general, like, especially to like the parents who are watching, is like ask your kids what they're doing, and like if they say that they're doing something really cool, like do not be afraid to reach out and say like, hey, I heard this was going on, like can you tell me more about it, because we would love to share that with you. And I think as a staff and as a team, I love getting to hear what everyone else is doing in their classroom, and I love getting to share what we're doing in our classroom. So more than anything, like the more that we as a community and as a school can sort of get to share with each other, I think that will only make us even better.
Fantastic. Any parting words for you, Laura?
I had many, and then Brianna started speaking.
She dropped the mic good, right? She said it all.
Yeah, but I did want to say, like, to fellow like teachers or colleagues out there, like we are reimagining education, and that requires us to reimagine education. Mm-hmm. And there's some work that goes into that in a fun way, in a creative way. And I think like a lot of the times we think about lessons we want to do, and we're like, no, we can't make that work, or no, like I don't know how to do that. But I think like taking the time to be like, how can I make it work, is so crucial to us thinking of how are we going to change education as a whole to work for students in 10, 20 years. So parting words.
All right. Well, this has been the very first Teacher Talk with Dr. K. I want to thank my phenomenal guests, Brianna and Laura. They teach 9th grade history at KAHS. They are history teachers. They are phenomenals. So we always want to open up the opportunity for you to come join us at our school to see other wonderful teachers similar to them. And this video will be shared. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to them. All right. Until next time, y'all. Bye.
Bye. Go Kraken.